The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 6, The Violet Keystone. Chapter 23. As Tal's words echoed in the chamber, Sushin fired a globe of shimmering violet back at Crow, and Malin's voice filled the air. A quavering, uncertain voice, speaking the words of the prayer to a steer. Crow dived aside, and the violet globe sailed past him, struck the wall between two windows, and exploded straight through, out into the air beyond, followed by a great plume of stone chips and dust. The effect of Malin's voice was equally spectacular. Sushin froze, his mouth open, his hand extended. Then his whole body blurred. There was his human form, and then there was a dark double that was separating out of him, stepping back from the human version. It was a shadow, leaving the flesh it had hidden in. As it came out, it changed and grew, growing larger and more menacing. Slowly, it assumed the shape that only Tal had seen before. A monster, a dragon, Sherakor himself. Fully out of his fleshly host, his reptilian body stretched from floor to ceiling. His head was long and spiked, his many-toothed mouth big enough to snap up Tal in a single bite. His wings were furled, as they would not fit in the chamber. His tail was long and ended in a bone shaped like a butcher's cleaver.
Austere herself could not bind me alone,
roared Sherakor.
How could you succeed where she failed and die for her failure? I do not see Danir, Susir, and Grettir come to do her work.
The Shadow Dragon's voice momentarily drowned out Malin's, and for a moment, Tal thought she had stopped. But then her voice came back again. Quiet, slow, but unafraid. Whether her prayer could bind Sherakor or not, he clearly didn't like it.
Speak your spell,
he roared again.
I shall not stay to hear it, but you I shall seek out, Witch of the Ice, if you still live when I return. Go now and tell your peoples that the Veil is destroyed, that Sherakor will soon finish the war your ancestors so foolishly began.
With that, the Shadow Dragon's head flashed down and bit off Sushin's hand. It held it in its mighty jaws for an instant, then the spirit shadow disappeared, and the hand fell to the floor, minus the sunstone ring that had been there a moment before. Malin kept reciting the prayer to a steer, even though the object of it was no longer visible. Crow rushed over to where Tal and Mila were writhing on the ground. "What happened?" he asked. "Where are you hurt?" "Spirit shadows," said Tal. He could barely speak between sobs of pain. "Sent back. Einar, we must follow. Get a bit. Get the ring. Get ring. Please. Please." Tal watched Crow turn and pick up the ring. This is where it happens, his shocked brain thought. This is the betrayal. This is where Crow takes the ring and walks away. There, he is turning now. This is the end. He was still thinking that when Crow slipped the half-keystone back on his finger. "I know the way to Einar," said Crow. "Abbot showed me once, but I never went. Now seems the time." "Get Mila," whispered Tal. He couldn't concentrate. "You reflect the light into our stones." Mila had already crawled a little closer. She did not speak or make any sound of pain when Crow grabbed her and dragged her next to Tal, rolling them both onto their backs and resting their sunstones on their chests, their heads on his lap. "Mila," muttered Tal. "Watch sunstone. Follow. Repeat." Crow began to visualize the colors and speak the way to Einar. His sunstone flashed, and he directed beams from it to the sunstones clasped in Mila's and Tal's hands. Through the pain, Tal tried to repeat the words Crow was speaking. He knew that they must get to Einar. They had to find Adris and Audris, who must be dying there. They had to get back and repair or raise the Veil again and prepare for Sherakor's invasion. Mila followed the words without thinking of anything else. The words and colors were all that mattered. She had to survive. Her people were depending upon her. She had failed them already and had not defended the veil. She must live to reverse her defeat. Mullen finished the prayer to Astir. But she did not feel its success. Sharakor must have returned to Einir to avoid the spell. He was not lurking, somehow invisible. Mullen saw Crow sitting with Tal and Mila cradled against him, with waves of many-colored light washing across all three of them. She saw Sushin dead or dying next to the pyramid, blood flowing freely now that the shadow in him was gone. Then she saw a flash of light at the very apex of the pyramid. It had been completely dark, but now the top began to shine with a weak red light. Mullen watched it, thinking the light might spread, but it didn't. Only the top glowed. She heard a noise behind her and whirled around, suddenly afraid. She was effectively alone, a crone disconnected from her mothers and sisters, without shield maidens or hunters to protect her. It was Ebbet, puffing and straining as he climbed the ramp. He saw Mullen staring at him wild-eyed, and Sushin behind, the almost totally dark pyramid, and the rainbow cocoon trio of Crow, Tal, and Mila.
What happened?
Mullen shivered, and found herself unable to speak, the words caught in her throat. Ebbet rushed past her, and after a further glance at the three who had clearly gone to Einir, he knelt beside Sushin, his sunstone glowing as he called up healing magic. Ebbet's spirit shadow sniffed at Sushin, then wandered over to sniff at the point where Adris and Audris had pulled apart Sushin's spiky spirit shadow. He had a shadow in him, blurted out Mullen. Sharakor, a dragon. He made Adris and Audris disappear, and Tal and Mila fell down. We were watching, and Crow used light magic, and I tried the prayer of Astir, but Sharakor said the veil was destroyed, and he'd come back.
The veil isn't destroyed. It's just fraying at the edges,
said Ebbet sharply. There was no indication of his usual dodderiness.
The red keystone is keeping it going, at least for a while, though not as strongly as it should, perhaps. What did Sharakor say about coming back?
He said he'd come back and finish the war, said Mullen. Oh, I'd better report. She stood up straighter and put her hands to her head. But the more she tried to reach the other crones, the more she heard Sharakor's awful voice and his threat that he would find her.
That'll hold you,
said Ebbet. Sushin opened his eyes. Thank you, but that will be quite... His voice trailed off, and an expression of total bewilderment spread across his face. Where am I? Who are you?
Rest now, soothed Ebbet. You've had an accident.
I was in Einir, said Sushin, having breakfast with Jolpuryan Baron. He was going to help me climb to Yellow. He paused for a moment. I dreamed, he said, after the pause. A terrible dream. My head was opened, and a stranger poured himself inside. His voice was getting more and more shrill as he spoke, building toward hysteria. Ebbet hastily raised his sunstone, and a green light fell down on Sushin's face. The Chosen's eyes closed, and he slumped back against the pyramid.
I'm not sure whether it would be more merciful to help him live or die, remarked Ebbet. I suppose, in as so many things, fate will decide. Imagine his last memory being breakfast with Jolpuryan Baron more than 30 years ago. I bet it was a rotten breakfast, too. Jolpur was a mean fellow. Come on, then.
Come on? asked Mullen. Where?
Einir, said Ebbet impatiently. You'll have to share my sunstone for the transition. Just stare at it and repeat what I say.
Einir, exclaimed Mullen. I can't go there.
You'll be needed, said Ebbet, from what I read in the Codex.
What do you mean?
Ah, that would be telling, replied Ebbet.
Yes, it would, said Mullen, stamping her foot. So tell me, you old hoarder? Being called a hoarder was a serious insult among Icecarls, for sharing food and essentials was a central part of any clan's survival. Ebbet, however, was not offended.
Oh, put like that, I suppose, he said, rubbing his nose. Having got rid of the veil, or close enough, Sherikor's next step must be to undo the forgetting. Since it was your crones, or the historical equivalent, that did the forgetting in the first place, it seems to me that you'll be required.
But I'm only a young crone, protested Malin.
You're the only crone who's right here, right now, answered Ebbet, taking her arm. Just stare into this sunstone.
But I should inform—
No time for that,
cried Ebbet. His spirit shadow had sidled up to his side, and his sunstone was already changing color, beginning the sequence that was part of the way to Einir.
They'll figure it out. Remember, say the words after me.
He started reciting, and Malin, despite herself, stared into the sunstone and repeated the words. Einir. She was going to Einir, where no Icecarl, save Mila, had been for 1,000 circlings or more. Neither of them noticed a trickle of silver slide out the back of Ebbet's shirt and roll across the floor. The Codex of the Chosen had spent too long in Einir, and it had no plans to return.